even the most critical of Hadith followers will agree that according to traditional Sunni Islam, Sahih Bukhari is the most authentic book after the Quran. So naturally, we should be able to trace Sahih Bukhari back to the person accredited for collecting and compiling this authoritative and definite Hadith compilation, and if not complete copies, at least manuscripts written by Imam Bukhari, right? Well, not really. No copy or manuscript written by Imam Bukhari exists today. Well, that's hardly a problem when Imam Bukhari had hundreds if not thousands of students, and his compilation reached us via numerous mass transmissions by his students, right? But unfortunately, that is not the case either. The farthest we can go back with the Sahih Bukhari is to this one alleged student of Imam Bukhari, Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Firabri. Why alleged? Because outside of him himself saying that Bukhari had 70,000 students, all have died, and I am the only one who remains, there is very little evidence he actually even was a student of Bukhari. And we actually don't even have copies or manuscripts by Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Firabri himself, the closest being within 1 to 2 generations after his passing, but scholars claim they follow his transmission line and recension. Anyways, let's put that aside for now. None of this would really be an issue until you start to examine the Sahih Bukhari according to the criteria set by muhaddisin, the Hadith scholars, in their Hadith sciences. For a Hadith to be declared Sahih, every narrator in a chain must have been vouched for as thiqa, meaning trustworthy, of sane mind and good memory. So obviously, people only who know a certain someone can vouch for him or her. If you have never met a person, or that person died before you were even born, can you give a personal guarantee that person was thiqa? And even if you do, what real value does your vouching for him really have? So every narrator in a chain has to be vouched for, and if he isn't, then that hadith, according to Hadith sciences, cannot be classified as Sahih. So what's the problem here, you ask? The problem is, no one ever really vouched for Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Firabri in his lifetime. He is an unknown. So any hadith that has a narrator that is unknown, meaning unvouched for, can at best be classified as Majhool. A Majhool hadith falls under Da'if hadith classification, meaning weak hadith. There are even subcategories of Majhool hadiths, but let's not get too technical here. And since the entire compilation of Sahih Bukhari goes back to this one, unvouched for person Mr. Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Firabri, meaning the 7,563 narrations contained in all the 9 volumes of Sahih Bukhari are transmitted by this one narrator or Majhool, as per Sunni Islam. The most authentic book after the Quran cannot be, with all sincerity according to their own sciences, be labeled as Sahih. So the Sahih is not so Sahih after all. The Hadith followers and scholars realized this, and 242 years after Firabri died, posthumously declared him thiqa al-Dahabi in 748 Hijri, and then al-Hajar as late as 852 Hijri. Now this also created another problem with their great book, the al-Rijal. The scholars had put authored, showing how all the narrators in every chain was thiqa with stories and biographies, since Firabri didn't have any. So they made up new rules to cover up such huge gaping holes and discrepancies, or risk losing their most authentic book. So the new rule was posthumous. Tawthiq, meaning endorsement, is allowed if the narrator's work was judged reliable, their students were trustworthy, and there was no real criticism. All arbitrary and open-ended, subjective, vague standards. So in the end, no real copies or manuscripts of the Bukhari exist. All of them are traced back to this one alleged self-proclaimed student of his, Al-Firabri, who no one in his lifetime vouched for that he was a trustworthy man. There are 3 main concerns. The near-divine status of Sahih al-Bukhari. Sahih al-Bukhari is often treated as sacrosanct, practically on par with the Quran in the eyes of many Muslims. While people might verbally deny this equivalence, in practice, Bukhari is rarely, if ever, criticized. Even verses of the Quran are sometimes sidelined if they contradict hadith in Bukhari. Problematic hadith content. Some hadith within Sahih al-Bukhari are, quite frankly, blasphemous, irrational, or degrading. Examples include narrations where the Prophet supposedly tried to seduce a woman and was rejected, or that Moses, had a scrotal hernia and chased after a rock that stole his clothes. Other narrations suggest that the Prophet was affected by magic to the point he hallucinated having sexual relations with his wives. There are many much worse examples that cannot be even repeated in polite company. Such narrations are not just questionable, they are deeply offensive to many Muslims and undermine the dignity of our prophets. Transmission integrity. The entire text of Sahih al-Bukhari as we have it today is reliant on one main narrator, Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Firabri. His manuscript was incomplete, and his students made alterations. Various manuscripts show discrepancies in chapter titles, chains of transmission, the isnads, and even hadith content. Later scholars like Sharafuddin al-Yunini attempted to standardize the text, but even his manuscript is lost. All we have are copies made by others, some of whom were financially incentivized. Even those standardized editions were later found to contain hundreds of errors. We cannot afford to live in a bubble of censorship and denial in an age of information. Our faith is not so fragile that it cannot withstand scrutiny. Why is it that people can critique the Quran in its meaning and wisdom without causing an uproar, but Sahih al-Bukhari is untouchable? Why is reason and the Quran itself sidelined when a hadith in Bukhari contradicts them? Let's look at this person, Firabri, in detail. Is this person, Firabri, reliable? Bukhari had many students, according to Firabri himself. Khatib al-Baghdadi brings a chain quoting Firabri to say there were 70,000 people who transmitted Sahih al-Bukhari from Imam Bukhari, and then he goes on to say, but none of them are alive today except me. There were many others who transmitted, but none of their complete copies exist today, and we have already covered that in part 1. Like Ibrahim ibn Makal, but even his version of Sahih al-Bukhari has only 1,200 hadith out of the over 7,700 in the complete Bukhari. So now we are left with every copy traced back to Firabri. So as per hadith sciences, he has to be vouched for? But why did nobody declare him to be Sittah, meaning reliable? This is the question, because he lives in a time where he is rubbing shoulders with some of the great scholars. He's obviously met Bukhari. He's in the time of people like Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood. He's in the time of Abu Hatim, Abu Zura. He's in the time of Nisai. He's in the time of all of these great scholars, and nobody who actually knows him ever vouched for him as reliable. Yes, there have been claims that he has been reliable by many scholars. The question is, when they say he is reliable, who has vouched for him? The earliest that they're going with are people that, first of all, never ever met him, came over 100 years after him. And then secondly, it's very suspect that they even said this because it's not in their books. So it's highly suspect. So to bridge this gaping chasm, the scholars come up with the excuse that just because people transmitted from him, that should make him reliable. Because he had at least one scholar of hadith called Al-Hafiz ibn Sakan, who transmits from him. Therefore, it should be fine. But you see, even Ibn Sakan, who takes Sahih al-Bukhari from Firabri, even he doesn't declare him to be reliable, but the scholars insist that this should make him reliable. Ibn Sakan, by the way, is known for his extreme lenient and relaxed attitude towards hadith and declares people Sittah or reliable. And even he hasn't declared Firabri Sittah. Even the great scholar Khatib al-Baghdadi said, if a scholar transmits from somebody, that does not mean they are declaring them reliable. And that anybody who believes that just because someone transmitted from someone makes him reliable is absolutely false and baseless. Which should be the case because then everybody would be reliable when it comes to hadith and history. And now we come to an even bigger problem than just Firabri himself. We've established that no one vouched for him as reliable, and those who did or were made to seem so also have issues. But even bigger issue is that we don't even have Firabri's own copy of Bukhari, and that's where the real problems start to surface. Firabri's student, Abu Ishaq al-Mustamli, says, I copied from Firabri's copy of Sahih al-Bukhari, and I saw many things that were still incomplete in his copy. He had chapter headings which were empty, they had no hadith in them, some hadith with no chapter heading, and he says, so we started to move them around. And what proves this to be true is, as said by Abu al-Walid al-Baji in Fath al-Bari by Ibn Hajar, that Mustamli's copy, Saraksi's copy, Kushmahin's copy, and Marwazi's copies are all different. So it shows, despite them taking from one book, they all different, but how? And they are not minor differences or mix-up. Disagreement with names and actual names in the isnad are missing as well. So Farabri's students did as each of them pleased with his incomplete copy of Bukhari. Then the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt and Syria commissions al-Yunini to standardize the Bukhari. So he does his grand makeover project with massive monetary backing from the Sultan to get it right. Yunini makes huge amendments, and he sits with the grammarian Ibn Malik, and they then make amendments to the Arabic as well. The question is, why were there such big errors even in the Arabic itself in the first place? And then, al-Yunini's grand copy also goes missing, and we only have copies from his copy, which then later on are redone again by under the commissioning of Sultan Abdulhamid II of the Ottoman Empire, and even that has several mistakes in it. The point is, can the scholars answer all these things? And the answer is they can't. Let's look at that claim once again, shall we? The claim is that this is the most authentic book on earth for Muslims after the Quran. Well, after having read through all of that, keeping in mind we haven't even touched upon the problem with Imam Bukhari himself, and he was well known for doing tadlis among many other things, it would be absolutely absurd to even think of Bukhari as the most authentic book. Another question, and this might be slightly conspiratorial, that comes to mind is, having gone through so many hands and before so many eyes over so many centuries, how come so many hadiths still being published till this day that make no sense and are just a jumble of words, hadith that have grammatical errors, to hadith that go against the Quran, to hadith that are downright insulting to Allah, Deen, and the Prophets? How come these hadiths haven't been omitted or filtered out in all this time and purposely kept in?
Now, let's turn our attention to the second so-called Sahih in the collection, Sahih Muslim, often ranked just behind Bukhari in terms of religious authority. It is widely accepted by Sunni Muslims as the third most authentic Islamic text after the Quran and Sahih Bukhari. This compilation was put together by Imam Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, a Persian scholar from Nishapur, modern-day Iran, who was born in the year 206 AH, nearly 2 centuries after the Prophet passed away. Like Bukhari, he never met any of the Prophet's companions, and just like Bukhari, none of the manuscripts of his work that were actually penned by him have survived to this day, not even a partial copy, not a page, not a paragraph, not even a single sentence. That's right, Sahih Muslim too is a collection with no existing manuscripts or fragments traceable directly to Imam Muslim. Everything we have today comes through intermediary transmitters, and unsurprisingly, this transmission chain has major issues. Here's the real shocker. Just like Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim boils down to a single primary student, Yaqub ibn Sufyan al-Fasawi. He is the main link between Imam Muslim and later generations, yet Imam Muslim himself never endorsed this man. There are no written statements, no personal notes, and no recorded affirmations by Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj vouching for Ibn Sufyan's role as a transmitter of his collection. And for those that don't know what this means in hadith sciences, this means that the person is not thiqa, unvouched for, which makes him not reliable enough to accept hadith from. By the rules of hadith authentication, that alone should have disqualified his version from being taken as authoritative. So who then first vouched for this crucial figure in the chain? It was the famous historian and scholar Shams ad-Din al-Dahabi. But here's the catch. Al-Dahabi was born nearly 500 years after Ibn Sufyan died. That's half a millennium of silence on this transmitter's authenticity before someone finally said, yes, he's reliable. Think about that. A book considered the second most authentic collection of hadiths in the Sunni tradition is preserved almost entirely through someone the compiler himself never authenticated, and who didn't receive validation until half a millennium later. But it gets worse. Even with Ibn Sufyan, we don't actually possess any surviving copies of Sahih Muslim that were written by him. The earliest full manuscript we have is attributed to a man named al-Jandi al-Kirimi. That copy is stored today in an Israeli library and dates back to over 400 years after Ibn Sufyan died. And even that attribution is speculative. Scholars assume it's based on Ibn Sufyan's transmission, but no hard evidence proves it. There are a few partial manuscripts that claim to come from other students of Imam Muslim, but none are complete, and the discrepancies among them are far from minor. According to Sunni scholars, the differences are not significant. But when you examine these variations, some of them include missing narrators or incomplete chains of narration, issues that the very science of Hadith transmission considers major red flags. In Hadith methodology, an incomplete chain can render a narration weak, fabricated, or outright invalid. Now here's where it all starts to get even murkier. Guess who else shows up again in this web of transmission? Yes, it's none other than our familiar friend, Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Firabri, the same controversial transmitter who is the sole link in the chain of Sahih Bukhari. Miraculously, he's also claimed to have been a student of Imam Muslim. And not just any student, he's said to have transmitted Sahih Muslim with such dedication that his version could have intermingled with Ibn Sufyan's. Let that sink in. The same person who supposedly single-handedly preserved Bukhari's magnum opus despite no contemporary endorsements and highly questionable credibility, is also said to have played a major role in transmitting Sahih Muslim. One man, two massive works, no original manuscripts, no corroborating endorsements. And all of this taking place over vast geographical distances between Bukhara and Nishapur, modern-day Uzbekistan and Iran, without any historical record of how he supposedly managed this feat. Did he take weekly flights, ride camels across deserts regularly? Or is this just another conveniently patched narrative constructed centuries later to keep the traditional storyline intact? Even Sunni scholars have had to concoct all sorts of explanations for how Firabri could have been a student of both Bukhari and Muslim. Some suggest he wasn't a direct student, but maybe a student of one of them. Others say he was present in the wider scholarly circles and may have simply overheard their teachings or picked them up indirectly. Yet Firabri himself claimed he was a direct student of Imam Bukhari. And not just any student, but the last surviving one. That alone gave his version of Sahih Bukhari the final stamp of approval. Now apply the same pattern to Sahih Muslim, and you start to see a trend. When you dig even a little below the surface, what appears to be a clean, preserved chain of transmission starts unraveling. The deeper you go, the more these unquestionable hadith collections begin to look like products of historical hearsay rather than reliably documented traditions. And just when you thought it couldn't get any more tangled, here comes another twist. Guess who else is claimed to have transmitted Sahih Muslim? Abu Isa al-Tirmidhi. Yes, the very same Tirmidhi who has his own hadith collection, Jami al-Tirmidhi, which just so happens to be one of the 6 Sahih Sittah. So we now have someone who's simultaneously compiling his own book and allegedly transmitting someone else's authentic compilation. It's a bit like Shakespeare writing Hamlet while also acting as the only surviving scribe of Plato's Republic, except without any original manuscripts, signatures, or verification. You can't help but feel that all of this starts to resemble a scholarly echo chamber, a closed network of names recycling each other's work and boosting each other's reputations, posthumously. It all starts to smell less like authentic preservation of the Prophet's words and more like a posthumous project wrapped in centuries of retroactive legitimization. So where does that leave us? The first 2 of the so-called Sahih Sittah, Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, are not as Sahih as they've been made out to be. The cracks are visible. The blind faith in their preservation crumbles under the weight of scrutiny. And what's most concerning is that these books form the very foundation of Islamic jurisprudence, theology, and daily practice for hundreds of millions of Muslims.
If this video challenged you to look at the Quran with fresh eyes, please hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that this perspective is important, helping this message reach others who are searching for these same answers. And if you want to join us as we continue to let the Quran speak for itself, subscribe and turn on notifications.